The very first photo I took on the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, I was immediately surprised. Samsung has barely changed the camera hardware compared to their last phone, and yeah, they did announce some new software features that should make things better, but they do that every year, and more often than not, it does not. And so seeing that all of a sudden the skin tones look a mile better, and that there is more detail in practically every single part of this image, made me think that there is actually a fighting chance that while the iPhone 16 Pro Max did pretty conclusively beat Samsung last year with 6.5 points to 4.5,
that Samsung can come back and take that crown with force. And to find out if it does, let's see how both of these cameras can capture my dream weekend in London. And of course it's raining.
So the second you open the camera, you'll immediately notice one of the biggest improvements that Samsung has made compared to last year. It's their camera experience is so much slicker. It looks a little less cluttered. They've trimmed some of the fat, like that god-awful AR emojis feature, which you would only use if you were trying to get bullied. And they have streamlined the settings so that you're not seeing like 50 different things at any given time. It feels like you can actually focus on what you're trying to shoot. And also, over the last few years, I've complained my fair share that you have to do too much stretching to get to these settings, which has always veered me more towards preferring the iPhone's camera app. But it looks like Samsung might actually have listened. Pretty much every single tweak can now be performed by your thumb and your thumb only, all topped off with the fact that it's now smoother to flick between the modes and zoom in and out of things, and faster in terms of the time taken to capture, significantly faster. It does feel on first impression like Samsung finally opened their ears and in one fell swoop addressed everything we've been asking for. Now, if you compare it to the iPhone, I would still say that Apple's app is noticeably faster and smoother. To be fair, it's a lot smoother at night. Samsung still falls apart there. But since Samsung does now feel fast enough that it's not an issue, while offering way more tweakability within this one camera app and this incredible anti-reflective display that makes interacting with it on a bright day just a complete breeze, I think it's time to bump Samsung up from a draw in the camera experience category last year to a full-on win.
Now, audio is the second key thing that Samsung says they've improved, which is pretty good timing since the London Underground is about the worst place we could have picked to film a video like this. And their improvement comes in the form of audio eraser.
Anytime after you've taken a video, you can ask AI to analyze that video for all the different types of noise within it, to then allow you to reduce the parts that you don't want to hear. So let's highlight my voice by turning down the rest. And we can do a very similar thing on the iPhone using Apple's audio mix feature.
So this is what I sounded like on the Samsung before the processing. This is what it sounds like after. It's effective, but at the same time it's not magic. It's working in quite a simple way, which means that it does cut into the quality of my voice at the same time. And then this is what the iPhone sounds like with the same effect. It's not perfect, but it is a little better. And that makes sense, because the iPhone has 4 microphones around its body compared to Samsung's 3, which means it does have a better understanding of what sounds are coming from which directions to be able to eliminate the ones you don't want to hear. So audio still goes to the iPhone.
But things get a little better now, because I am very happy to say that video quality is now tangibly better. Samsung talks every year about how their video quality has improved, and usually it just feels like that one X who comes running back once per year promising that they've changed. But this time, if we actually just pull up the Galaxy S24 Ultra for comparison, you can see slight improvements in still videos taken during the day. Things are a little brighter, things are a little more detailed. You can see substantial improvement to videos taken in middle lighting conditions, especially when you add in some movement, since the S25 Ultra can now intelligently separate the ways that it treats static and moving objects. And then in low light, you can't not see the difference, especially when you look at how much less noise there is in the sky above. You know what, Samsung? You needed to improve video, you have improved video. This calls for a celebration. Whoa. The S25's footage is now good enough that in most lighting conditions, I wouldn't actually say the iPhone is necessarily better. And that is a huge deal. For years, the iPhone has been the undisputed king of video. It had this whole extra layer of detail, even in bright lighting, that no Android has been able to match, likely due to the insane synergy that Apple gets from both being able to design their chips and also create the camera software that goes with those chips. That said, this is only a half party, because when the lighting dips, Samsung loses its clarity a little faster than Apple. Can you see how on the Apple you can see the full gradient of light, whereas on the Samsung there's kind of like this dark mush on my head? Or how in this scene, shot on the phone's ultra-wide cameras, Samsung, while no longer getting obliterated, is still just being slightly outdone, with Apple being better able to control the bright spots to not overexpose them. And then, as you probably expected, Samsung is still significantly behind at night, and there's a specific reason for it, but I'll get to nighttime soon. That is a separate story. For the purposes of now, just know that Samsung is getting close, closer than I thought they would this time, but they are not quite there.
But now it's time to get some views. So we are about to head to the perfect little spot to try and see London City from above, because that's going to be the best place to test the zoom cameras on these phones.
So even though compared to the S24 Ultra, there hasn't actually been any zoom hardware upgrades, Samsung is claiming that their new software alone is going to make all the difference. Okay, so if we zoom all the way into one of these buildings on the S25 Ultra versus last gen, the further in you get, the more that you can actually notice the improvement to resolving images. And by that I mean the camera isn't actually capturing any more information. It's the same camera, but the software just now better understands how to piece that information together into the final image. And so, does it beat the iPhone? Well, the iPhone 16 Pro Max has one telephoto camera for zoom. It's a 12 megapixel camera with a 5x optical zoom rating, whereas the S25 Ultra has two telephoto cameras, a 10 megapixel 3x optical zoom camera, basically for things that aren't too far away, and then a 50 megapixel 5x zoom camera for things that are. And the results are pretty much as clean cut as that. Samsung looks better at 3x, it looks better at 5x, and it looks better beyond 5x. There are definitely some points where the AI processing feels a little too much. It's almost like someone took a Sharpie and started drawing on extra outlines to make the image look more defined than it actually is. But I'd still always choose this camera if I wanted to take long-range shots. It's the difference between having an image that does look artificially enhanced versus having an image that's practically beyond hope. And then when you want to take zoomed-in video, let's say you're at a concert, then it brings me great joy to say that it having better zoom hardware than Apple, combined with now better video quality than last year's Samsung, means that the S25 Ultra wins on all fronts when it comes to zoom now. Okay, 2 points to each phone right now. This feels like a pretty good time to just go right back to basics for a minute. If you strip away all of the fancy extras, then which phone on auto captures the best shots from its rear cameras? Well, last year I awarded this category to the iPhone, since it would take higher resolution photos, it would take those photos faster, and most importantly, the ultra-wide camera was just straight up 4 times the resolution of Samsung's. But you can tell Samsung has been thinking about this. The new 50 megapixel ultra-wide camera on the S25 Ultra is, I would say now, very much equivalent to the iPhone in detail. And the thing that I really appreciate is that if we flick between the ultra-wide and the main camera versions of this shot, neither phone has any color shifting now. This is incredibly subtle and yet also incredibly hard to achieve. Because traditionally, cameras don't have any awareness of the space that they're shooting in. All the camera knows is, this scene is really bright, for example, I'm gonna fiddle some settings to make it darker. And then the second you go to a wider angle, the scene might get darker on average. And so your camera will decide to brighten it up again. And so to you, both of those images will look very different to each other. You don't get that here. And now that Samsung has also brought the time taken to capture your shot way down, this no longer feels like the slower, clunkier camera that's far less likely to be ready in time. Okay, but then the two things that they haven't yet cracked are, first, resolution. While Apple can take 24 megapixel photos by default on its main camera, Samsung is still stuck at 12. And while that doesn't mean that Apple's photos look close to twice as good as Samsung's, they do have the edge if you peek closely. And this isn't like a one-off. I'd say in 90 to 95% of photos taken on default settings auto, as soon as you zoom in, you will encounter some softness on Samsung where Apple is pin sharp still. And then the second part of the equation is storage. The efficiency of the iPhone's file format means that even though it's taking higher resolution shots, it's doing so while only actually consuming about 80% of the storage space of Samsung. And here's the kicker. The iPhone also, by default, within this tiny file size, is capturing live photo data. So that little bit of video just before the shot is taken. Samsung doesn't do this automatically, and if you turn it on, its file size is only going to increase further. So given that in terms of the style of the photos, it's more of a personal preference, and I wouldn't really say that one is consistently better than the other, I'm going to give the photos category on balance to the iPhone. That said, it's not really very close at all after you've taken the shot. The editing suite on Samsung's phone is leagues ahead. While I'm happy to see that Apple has finally introduced Cleanup, their way to remove distractions from your photos, it does just feel like Samsung's generative edit application is quite a few steps ahead right now. You can move and resize objects, which Apple's Photos app just doesn't let you do. And when you try to remove things from your photos, have a look at this comparison. Same image, but can you see how Samsung really genuinely made this person in the background look like they never even existed? Whereas the iPhone's prediction of what was behind them is just not the one. Using these two AI editors side by side, it feels a bit like using ChatGPT 4 and then going straight back to ChatGPT 2. Plus, Samsung has Best Face, which if you do turn on that motion photo feature, lets you pick the best face in any given photo you've taken, quite often improving the end output. Samsung can turn a photo into a live photo with real moving elements, elements. It can remove reflections from windows, it can remove shadows from darker parts of images, and that's not even getting into the whole now upgraded image generation part of the equation. The ability to load up a photo you've taken, to ask it to make the sky a sunset, for example, to pick a style and then sit back and let it cook. To be fair, I don't actually know when I would use this. And on a similar note, Samsung did also introduce this new way to make filters. You give the phone a photo that you like, and it then takes the color tone, the saturation, and the brightness of that image to apply it to other shots. It's very reminiscent of Apple's photographic styles feature, but like, maybe even less useful? A couple of gimmicks aside though, pretty easy point to Uncle Sam in this category. Now, when Samsung announced that thanks to a new image signal processor, the S25 phones will take significantly better selfies than the S24 phones, I didn't think that much would come of it. But it turns out that the S25 phones are finally the generation where Samsung has figured out skin tones, and selfies are the place where you notice that the most. I would say that if the previous phones got skin tones 70% right, then we're at a solid 90 right now. And that, plus the improved handling of textures, does give these photos a definitive facelift. And so compared to the iPhone, this is pretty easy. Given that I already thought the S24 Ultra took better selfies than the iPhone, the S25 Ultra is now comfortably ahead. I prefer the style, I prefer the way it makes skin look, and it's got that extra pop of color, which is nice. In most cases, it just gives scenes that ever so slight, even better than real life feeling. But occasionally it can also actually ruin it by making the image look a little artificial. But overall, point to Samsung, actually putting this phone in the lead right now. What Samsung has never been as good as Apple at though, is when you switch over to selfie video.
But this is exciting. Let's have a look at this. I'm talking about the sandwich. This is the greatest sandwich I have ever tasted in my life. I had it once a couple of months ago, and all I've been thinking about is coming back and meeting it for the second time. Oh, sweet mother of cheese.
Anyway, Apple has still got video on lock. Just like with selfie photos, I prefer Samsung's style, the sharpness on faces and the contrast, but it is still a little grainier than Apple's footage. And the biggest reason, I think, is the lack of optical image stabilization. The iPhone's front camera has it, whereas Samsung has to rely on an electronic equivalent of it. And that's fine when it's really bright, but the dimmer it gets, the less precise that electronic stabilization becomes, and the more jittery that footage starts to look. So still a point to the iPhone, but it is getting closer. And there was something I was really glad to see.
So this is footage taken on both phones' Instagram cameras. So this is shot on Instagram, it's uploaded to Instagram, and then it's downloaded again. And you know what? Samsung actually looks all right. We did this exact test last year, and the footage from the Samsung was absolutely butchered. So something has clearly improved here, because it doesn't look like it's losing any more information than the iPhone is.
Now this might not even affect you at all, but for me, 50% of my front camera usage is via these applications. So this feels like a big weight finally off Samsung's shoulders. Although, really weird thing that I did notice, when you compare the S25 to the S24, when things get dark, then the S25 actually looks worse. It's super smoothed out, and this is with all face beautification off. And now, just before we start to wrap this up and to crown a winner, we have to talk special modes. These are your extra features, things like slow-mo, cinematic portrait mode style video, and close-up macro shots. Last time I awarded the win to the iPhone, partly because Apple's slow-motion video just looked higher quality than Samsung's, and to be honest, I'd still say that's the case this time round. Samsung hasn't done much to remedy it. Although I do like the fact that on the S25 Ultra, you can effectively instant slow-mo any video just by holding down on it. Both phones are fairly comparable with cinematic mode video. Samsung's is a little dark, but I wouldn't say actually looks any worse. What has, though, dramatically changed in Samsung's favor is macro mode. So when you go really close to an object, both of these phones will switch to their ultra-wide cameras, because these cameras have shorter focusing distances, and then they will crop into that ultra-wide to both make the transition less janky and also cut off the distortion that you would usually get around the edges of an ultra-wide shot. But then, if you really think about it, that's not great, because you're using a lesser camera to take the shot, and you're not even getting the full picture from that lesser camera, which is pretty much why historically macro shots are not the prettiest. But since Samsung's ultra-wide camera has now just gone from 12 megapixel all the way to 50, similar to what the iPhone is now, it gives the phone way more room to retain a high resolution even with that crop. I'd say it's actually the slightly more detailed macro camera now, which might have been enough for me to move this category up to a draw for Samsung, until you also factor in action mode, which is what you'd use to avoid any scene involving intense stabilization. And it just feels like Apple does a better job at that stabilization. Yeah, this trip to London ended up a little wetter than I was hoping. Just like most of them, to be honest. But let's be really honest, if you want to do stabilization properly, then the Insta360 Flow 2, our sponsor, basically takes the best phone gimbal that I've ever used and makes it so much better that it's now just one of my favorite phone gadgets of all time. For example, you want to pair it to your phone, you literally tap and NFC does the work for you. And you can now use the gimbal's tracking features within your native camera app, which makes it so frictionless. It's got MagSafe compatibility, so there's no more fiddling around adjusting the grip. It's got an upgraded selfie stick, as well as a new and improved tripod baked inside of it. And while it's standing on that tripod, the gimbal can lock onto you and follow you using up to 15 times zoom. Plus, it supports tracking for multiple people together now. And honestly, the list goes on. This thing has even better stabilization than before, even better tracking than before, better connectivity. It has teleprompter features. It can be a battery bank for your phone if you ever need it. Link below to find out more. And the first 30 purchases get a free MagSafe accessory. Okay, let's make one thing very clear. Portrait mode shots are absolutely class on the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra. I just feel like the edge detection and the style in almost all lighting conditions is nicer than Apple's. Doesn't this just look great? The iPhone has a sort of faintness to it that isn't doing it any favors. Now, Apple does get a slight boost when you take portraits using its main one-time zoom camera, since, as we talked about, every photo that comes out that camera will come out at a nice, crisp 24 megapixels. But then again, I think you'd be doing your portraits a disservice by taking them at 1x. Your subject is going to look way more proportionally correct if you instead shoot at 3x zoom or even 5x zoom and you take a few steps back. And in both of those cases, it's a Samsung win. I guess the other benefit of Samsung having two separate telephoto cameras. One thing I do have to flag though is Samsung's AI processing can get a bit carried away. It's like so involved in every photo now that it can even end up adding in skin texture that I swear doesn't even exist. And then finally, it's time to talk nighttime. So to get one thing out of the way, the improvement on the S25 Ultra versus last year's S24 Ultra are pretty undeniable. Like, for example, just look at the sky in this video here. Can you see how the old Samsung is a grainy mess and the new one is at least 50% smoother? Or if we take this photo, while the brightly lit areas look largely the same, all you have to do is to look around them to find that, like, every part of the rest of the image does look better now. But here's the issue. Let's pull up the iPhone now for comparison. It feels like the primary technique that the Samsung has been taught to combat its previous graininess is to smooth over it. And while it has absolutely gotten intelligent at doing that, and it can make lots of clips look better than they used to by doing it, it still can't compete with the iPhone like this, whose night videography comes out clean enough in the first place that it doesn't even need that smoothing. This difference means that in low light, while Samsung doesn't look like it's falling apart anymore, it just looks very soft. It's not capturing nearly to the same level of intricacy as Apple's footage. And for the most part, but to a lesser extent, that is true for photos too. Most photos taken in the dark, whether or not the specific night mode has activated, just look slightly muddier on the Samsung. Like, just for reference, of the 50 or so test night photos that I took, I only found 2 that I thought Samsung did a better job with. This phone struggles enough at night that even zoom shots, you know, the single category that Samsung very conclusively wins at in most daylit scenarios, when the lights go, Apple often creeps ahead at. And so that leaves us with a score of 5-6 to the iPhone. To be clear, the points aren't everything. Some categories do matter more than others. That said, do I think the iPhone is, on balance, the better camera between the two? I do, slightly. And most of it rests on the fact that while Samsung is improving their video game, they have to do it faster. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the full review.